didn't go through. I forgot to click one last button. Here we go. Let's try again. All right, everybody. So finally, Ivan the Heathen is here with us. I had a long build up for this discussion. I've been looking forward to it. We had 3 previous conversations on the channel about the history of liberalism. So hopefully you got a chance to check out some of those. Today, we will finally be suspending the non-aggression principle. We'll have our cage match. You can imagine the strobe lights and the smoke machine. The announcer is giving his spiel. So, I don't think this has to be an acrimonious debate. Ivan and I agree on probably 99% of what libertarianism actually entails in the real world. My position is distributivism, so I believe that a certain level of sustenance has to be guaranteed. It's a kind of basic human right. And then also some level of provision and guardianship has to be available for the future of the planet as a whole. I'm not going to give a full outline of my position, but that's basically where I'm coming from. As far as ordinary people, they should be granted, I believe they should be granted the maximum amount of freedom. Voluntary interactions should prevail instead of coercive ones. But I do appreciate the way that Ivan has stuck to his guns over all these years. He's made, very good arguments for his position and for other positions that he holds. Just his channel is full of good arguments, the videos that are up on it. So anyway, why don't, Ivan, you go ahead and give a basic outline of your position, make the case for libertarianism, and we'll take the discussion from there.
Okay, well, thank you for having me on again. And, basically I think there are 2 ways that you can approach the issue. I guess kind of a positive way and a negative way. So on the positive side, I generally start with just thinking more generally about property rights and what they are and why they're important for society, and then sort of build things up from there. So as I see it, a system of property rules needs to exist in order to prevent conflicts from emerging or from raging on interminably over scarce resources. So a system of property rules is basically just a set of rules delineating who owns what, who has the right to control which given scarce resource, so that in any case of conflict, it will be possible to resolve the conflict, determine who is right and who is wrong, and so forth. So any kind of society whatsoever needs to have some system of property rights, some system of property rules. It's not imaginable to have one with none at all. So once we go from there, we then ask the question of, all right, what sorts of property rules should we have? And you can imagine any type of property arrangement you like, but many of them have all sorts of problems. I mean, for example, let's imagine a pure communism where everyone owns an equal share of everything. Immediately, practical problems crop up. For example, whenever a new person is born, does this mean that we then have to reshuffle the entire property structure? And how could that be done? So basically, given that I believe there are some pretty serious problems with more or less any other kind of arrangement, the set that I think works best, the set of property rules, is basically first that when there is some unowned bit of property, whoever it is that appropriates the property first sort of transforms it in some intersubjectively ascertainable way, or puts a border around it and so forth, claims it, and then after it is claimed, property titles may be exchanged, through any kind of voluntary agreement between mutually existing owners. And once you have this network of rules, you basically have what amounts to a libertarian social order emerging out of that. That's sort of the bottom-up case. And then the other prong of the argument goes in a top-down sense, where you just sort of think about what the state is and its effects upon society and the perniciousness of them. Well, there are a number of ways you can think of the state. I mean, the standard libertarian analysis uses the Weber's definition that it's an organization that holds a monopoly right on the initiation of force in a given territorial area, and that's fair enough as it goes. But there are also other ways to think about it. A good operational definition of the state, if you ask me, is that it's basically an organization that serves to prevent the circulation of elites, or to slow down that circulation to the greatest extent possible, because basically a state is designed to set up some oligarchical class and insulate that class from social feedback. See, normally you would have a free market firm that's subject to a profit and loss test, and the purpose of profit and loss is to allow the owners of the firm to ascertain whether they are using resources well or poorly. Now, in the state, nothing like this exists, and so you get this inevitable insulation of feedback. You get, again, elites don't circulate, errors accumulate, and bad things happen. So, I mean, that's sort of the capsule case, in a nutshell.
All right. Yeah. So I agree that some level of property rights have to exist for a society to function. I mean, this problem of scarce resources, who gets to use a particular thing, that question has to be decided at some level. And this basic principle that whoever first appropriates a good or a piece of land and makes something of it, I can see a natural law case being made that this is just part of being human. Our property is kind of an extension of our will. Neurologically, when we're holding a tool, when we're using something, it does really become an extension of ourselves. So I'm happy to accept that on some level, but where you run into problems with absolutizing this is in scenarios where some coercive mechanism has been employed to result in a monopolistic distribution of land, especially, and other resources, and then you have to correct this situation, right? We didn't evolve to our current state of society through pure libertarian principles. Coercion has been used all along the way, and currently the distribution of wealth is extreme, and a very small number of people own most of the surface area, the land, the arable land that's out there, and that they because of that, they have leverage to continue their kind of coercive system of government over us, the informal government, not the state strictly speaking, but the ruling class has leverage because they've acquired this monopoly through, immoral means. Now, when I look at this, I see that just, if we instituted pure libertarian principles today, because they already have this massive concentration of capital, and because of Pareto distribution of productivity, they have the tools now to maintain an edge. I think this is probably a technical point of disagreement between us, but my fear is that once you have inequality, the people who have more will just snowball that effect because they earn more on their savings, they are able to get capital and productive equipment that people without these means can't get. So that's the fears. Once you have inequality, something has to correct that state of affairs if you agree that it was achieved immorally in the first place. And I don't see libertarianism having the ability to bring things back. So how do you address that contention?
Well, in two ways, I guess. I mean, it seems to me that you're sort of making a utilitarian argument that, granted that there's some unjustly arrived at distribution, even if we allow libertarian principles to operate, it won't return things to a sort of better distributed state. Now, the first thing is, okay, given that some resource, this is the principled aspect of the discussion, the sort of a priori side of it. Given that some resource was appropriated unjustly, if someone else can demonstrate, this is in a libertarian, kind of idealized libertarian situation, if you can demonstrate that your property has been taken from you if you can demonstrate a claim to it, then obviously, yes, it should be returned to you. But if you have a situation like, you know, some conquest occurred hundreds of years ago, and yes, some people were robbed, but we can't exactly delineate what happened and so forth. In that instance, I'd probably favor the maxim that possession is 9/10 of the law, and I expect that this might cause some worry for you. So the second part of what I want to say has to do with the actual dynamism of a free economy and how it operates and how wealth tends to flow from it. This actually works out pretty well because I mentioned, and as I opened the discussion, that you can look at a state as an institution dedicated to preventing the circulation of elites, and a free market economy, subject as it is, since every entrepreneur is at every moment subject to the profit and loss test, whatever status he has achieved, he has to continuously work as best he can to satisfy the desires of consumers, to predict them, to forecast them. And if he fails, his capital holdings will suffer accordingly. Now, historically, and you can point to the United States, which is the situation I know best, but I'm sure this is obviously true in every other country, there have been large capitalist interests who, upon achieving large firms, noticed that they were continuously under threat from competition, and they began appealing to the state to protect their market dominance. The story about Rockefeller in particular is pretty amusing. He wanted, of course, to monopolize the oil industry, and he started out his efforts to do this in the standard way. He would just buy out competitors. But it started to become clear that this wasn't working, because the moment he bought out a competitor, the competitor just took the money that Rockefeller gave him and used it to immediately start a new oil company up again. So obviously he turned to the state to put up barriers to entry, to prevent others from competing with him as easily. But that is certainly a problem. This use of the state to safeguard your position, I oppose it utterly, but it's not something that would be tolerated under a libertarian system. And I think that once you remove these restrictions, a free economy is pretty dynamic, and elites do circulate rather quickly. I'm trying to recall a few interesting statistics just off the top of my head. I remember reading somewhere, I think this is in a book called Openness to Creative Destruction, which basically said that prior to COVID has changed things, obviously, but prior to COVID, the typical turnover in employment in 1 year was something like 14%. So 14% of jobs disappeared in a typical year. And most people don't even notice this. I mean, I didn't know this. That shocks me that it's that high. And yet things, sort of churn along, and you don't have these enormous disruptions. So basically, a free economy where prices are allowed to adjust, where people are allowed to adjust their behavior to others, will resolve these issues. I mean, I don't see any particular reason why you should expect even someone with an advantage to maintain that advantage forever, because the advantage is not given to you. If you have a large accumulation of capital, you can only maintain it in a free market system if you continue to serve the consumer. And if you do continue to serve the consumer effectively, well, then I don't see a problem with allowing the person to stay rich. But if he fails, he will suffer the consequences. And I think that people who are skeptical of this don't realize how difficult that actually is, because you're never allowed really to rest on your laurels. I just think subjecting these people to the rigors of competition will, smooth out some of these problems, and B, turn their behavior to a socially useful end.
Right. So I guess in response to that twofold argument, there are two sides of this. One, the principled side, and to look at that case, let's just draw an island scenario. Suppose that on this island, 3 generations ago or so, there was a great tyrant who had his gang of warriors around him, and he ended up acquiring 90% of the land on that island and controlling it in perpetuity. His descendants occupy this land, and a feudal arrangement arises. And then a libertarian revolution happens on this island. How does that solve the situation? It seems like since the descendants of this man own that territory, and they have this feudal arrangement where they're going to benefit from, say, it's not a technological civilization, but it's just a primitive kind of agricultural civilization. Why is it in the interest of that class descended from that tyrant to give up their land ever? Like, how do new actors get into the game? If they have the majority of the land already, how does an up-and-coming agriculturalist get into business, That's the first side, but...
Okay. Well, I don't know that it would really make a difference whether the society you're talking about is agricultural or more technologically advanced as far as the principle goes. I mean, as I said, if some land has been stolen and you can demonstrate that it's been stolen from you, that you can point to some ancestor that owned it and, point to, give specific evidence, and yes, the heirs of the tyrant should be compelled to give that back. Now, supposing that you can't find things like that, and then let's say you just leave whatever can't be demonstrated to have been stolen with the heirs of the tyrant. Well, their land now has a certain capital value. It has a certain productive capacity, and they need to make decisions about how to use that land. What to do with it. If they just, let's say, sit on it and don't produce for a market, or just barely produce enough to feed themselves, the capital value of the land is going to plummet. I mean, remember, values on a market are determined by the kind of general subjective evaluation of everyone in the society. So it's not like they can control how others evaluate their land, absent state intervention. So they will suffer the consequence of their capital values plummeting, and this will impoverish them. I mean, it will limit what they can do. They presumably have a certain amount of wealth, and they will use it to do things. But if your land value drops precipitously, 80% or whatever, it's going to limit what you can do, and it will provide you with an incentive either to, get yourself into gear and start using the land properly, or if you don't know how to do this, to sell a portion of it to someone who does. So you will have that kind of redistributive mechanism occurring.
Right. But if this is the only territory available and these people own 90% of the arable land, it's not simply the subjective evaluation of consumers on a market that will determine prices. It's also kind of a real... this class has the people in a real pinch, right? Their subsistence is dependent on this class of landowners, which means they might, for example, be willing to go and work that land for next to nothing. Like, there's no real minimum. If the alternative to working for the landed aristocracy there is starvation, they will work for basically nothing. Like, if you're in a pinch like that, that's what the island is meant to illustrate, right?
And what will the aristocrat do with his land if there's no one to work it and it just sits fallow?
Right, yeah. I mean, it's in their interest to have their serfs, but it's not in their interest to ever allow the serf class to get in a position where they could pose a threat to that ruling class.
Well,
right.
Are you suggesting that the ruling class will attempt to set up a new state? Or are we allowing this to proceed within the context?
No, it's purely libertarian, but they somehow began the game owning 90% of the land. Now, if maybe that ruling family, it's all one cousinage or something, they have a principle in their family that you never let go of your land, and they're, reasonable stewards of it. They keep being productive. But because they have this leverage, because they control the food supply of the people, wages are never able to rise because there's no meaningful competition among employers, right? They can pay the workers on their fields whatever they they want effectively, because the alternative for the laborers is just starvation.
Well, even in a case like the Soviet Union, where the state owned 97% of the land and there was a small parcel of, I think the other 3% was privately owned, the actual productive differential was enormous. The 3% that was privately owned produced 25% of the food. So if the descendants of the tyrant do mismanage the land, the productive capacity will fall relative to the other 10%. Now, if they don't, let's say they actually manage the land well, what does that entail? Managing the land well? Well, it means producing a lot of food, and it means ultimately, keeping people fed. It does mean, generating a reasonably, decent standard of living for people. The more productive the land is, the more food they produce. Other things being equal, the price of food will fall, and so the other people will, have a higher standard of living. Will be able to eat more. Will have more resources. And now we're assuming that they can't leave the island here. Is that the?
Yeah, the world is just the island.
Okay, so, and we're also not allowing hydroponic, agriculture or anything like this. Aqua. We're not allowing them to say, fish or do anything like that.
Well, yeah, I guess they could fish. We're in the feudal age here.
Okay, because you can sort of constrict the example so much that you make it so that by definition it becomes impossible for people to do anything. So I'm trying to get a feel on how constricted the example is. But okay, so they can fish, they can acquire resources, but you can't build a boat and leave the island. Okay.
Well, there's nothing else out there anyway. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, so the family just decides never to sell under any circumstances?
Well, they could have this tradition. Maybe it's not 100% of the time enforced, but perhaps it is. I mean, sometimes those family customs can be very, very powerful. The pressure would be to maintain their privileged position, guarantee a social status for all of their descendants because they're born into this position.
Well, I think then you'd start to get a similar problem to the circulation of elites issue. Suppose you have a generation of these people who are reasonably good stewards of the land and things go well, fairly well. But this isn't going to continue forever. I mean, at some point, there's going to be some scion of the family who's, just an imbecile and doesn't take care of the land very well. So I don't think that you can indefinitely forestall that kind of consequence. I mean, you're sort of assuming an example where there is no effect on the capital value of the land that will ever induce the family to sell. I don't think that's realistic. I mean, at some point, they'll break, At some point, a line will be crossed. I mean, that does happen in the real world at all times. So is this a fair example? I don't know. I mean, I don't think it's realistic to assume that they would literally never sell under any circumstances. But
But it is possible. So I'm just kind of testing the limits of your intuitions on this, the morality of the situation. I mean, to my mind, if I'm this peasant class on this island and there's no meaningful prospect of social advancement, maybe I start speculating about other forms of political organization other than a libertarian one.
Okay, but if there are no meaningful forms of social advancement, why would that be the case? That would not just be unconnected with poor stewardship of the land that the elite class owns. I mean, I assume there'd be some connection there. You're poor because these landlords don't use their resources productively, and so your standard of living is low.
Well, even if the estates are extremely productive, there's no reason, like I said before, for the ruling class to pay higher wages. The interest is giving them enough to sustain them as laborers, as was the case in Mesopotamian civilization or Egypt, where the workers would have a very kind of bare bones carbohydrate based diet. And in these sorts of societies, the regardless of how productive it was, you didn't compensate the dependent working class beyond a certain threshold.
Well, higher wages would be the consequence of increased productivity. That's just what it would mean in actual fact. If you can produce more food and the laborer can eat more and food is cheaper, it doesn't really matter whether you reckon this in monetary terms or not. He is effectively, making more.
Right. But, okay, so you get more purchasing power for whatever currency they're using here, but food can't really be a currency, right?
Well, it doesn't need to be. I mean, it doesn't need to be a currency. It's just that the greater availability of food and that greater purchasing power results in the higher standard of living.
Higher in terms of having more access to food, but not in terms of, I mean, I don't see how that equates to improving your social position. I think that's the number one thing that people are concerned about in like the justness of an economic system. They want it to be fair, and they want to be able to rise up the ranks and acquire higher status. Now, if I don't see how food gets you there. Being able to afford food is great, but that's not everything.
Okay. So if the concern is status, how is status to be determined in this society? I mean, is it just wealth that is the result of it? Is it, I mean, that would depend on the specifics of the social arrangement. I mean, I assume that this is related to wealth, or even just land ownership, right?
Right. So I would imagine that the ruling family would have their pick, like all the sons would have their pick of the eligible women on the island, and vice versa, and there would be resentment about this. In evolutionary terms, the peasantry would be worried that if this situation persists, this aristocracy is simply going to biologically inherit the island, because every generation they are at the top of the heap. They are able to afford as many children as they want. They have the space to house their children, whereas we're huddled up in this crowded, 10% of the island, and we don't have access to the rest, right? So that's the worry.
Well, all right. I mean, you're okay. I'm just trying to get a clearer picture of the situation, because again, it really depends on how much you want to constrict the example. So, again, the peasants do have bargaining power of their own. They'll say, look, pay us well, feed us reasonably well, or we don't work. And they can, if they have access at least to the 10% of the land they have access to, let's say someone else owns it, and he treats them reasonably well as opposed to the former feudal class or whatever, the productivity of his land and the wages that he's going to be able to offer the peasant workers are going to rise in proportion. And so the capital value of his 10% will rise relative to the 90%. Now, you're assuming by how you're constructing the example that this will have no effect on the ruling family's behavior. I just don't accept that as a reasonable stipulation.
No, it would have some effect, but the point I'm driving at is that if it's an issue of sustenance, if it's an issue of feeding the island, feeding everyone who needs to be fed, and you can't feed everyone with that 10% of the land, then they don't really have the bargaining power to back out of their employment with the landowners. They could work for that person who owns 10% of the land, but perhaps the population can't be sustained off of that 10% of the land, and they can't all work that 10% of the land because it's restricted. The population is such that they have to, if they want to feed everyone, they have to work the 90% of the land to some extent. And then you get this issue where the working class doesn't have bargaining power. They have no meaningful way of improving their situation. Now, to some extent, I do see that the free market mechanisms tend to counterbalance. And like you said, the owner of the 10% of the land would, by treating his workers better, by compensating better, by innovating his production methods, whatever it is, he would gain a comparative advantage, and his stock may rise. Better management should win out, and that should result in the greater good overall. That is a general principle, but there there comes a point where there is just real world leverage where one group of people controls the vital resources for another group of people. There are geographic constraints like this island scenario, or the kind of world that, let's transpose this into like a sci-fi scenario, which we addressed in the comments once, where, okay, we have a ruling class that has gotten where it's gotten through fractional reserve banking and all sorts of shady practices, starting wars all over, war profiteering, like really immoral stuff. And with all of these trillions and trillions of dollars, they have built this kind of parallel society, gotten all of the high IQ people working for them, researching this technology, and they're basically ready to launch with some form of transhumanism. And they've kept all of this, relatively secret. This is their kind of covert research and development. They've acquired this ability to connect themselves, network their minds, operate at a much higher cognitive level. They also still control most of the real world capital, most of the factories, most of the land. But then at this point in time, all of a sudden they institute global libertarianism. But they have this massive advantage because of all the things that they've done in the past that were immoral. And now they have, higher IQ because they have exclusive access to this transhuman technology. Supposing that is possible, etc. Now, my fear there is that the masses who have been siphoned off of all of this time through fractional reserve banking, taxes, etc., they will not be able to compete on the free market with this group of people that is given an incredible advantage, cognitively even, and that the result would be, in biological terms, once again, that this group, the ruling group, would simply take over the planet gradually for themselves because they're starting from this elevated position.
Well, this is just a complexification of the same example. I mean, there's a lot here. Example, restricting access to these sorts of transhuman technologies. Well, this kind of brings up another issue, because it is in practice very difficult to keep these things from leaking out to at least some degree. I mean, if you do develop some sort of transhuman abilities, some kind of add-ons or something like that, it's probably not going to be developed in one fell swoop. Like, it's not like we're normal humans and then some breakthrough happens and immediately we reach the transhuman stage. It's going to come gradually. So there are going to be sort of progressive additions to each thing. And there is going to be economic incentives to offer these things to a mass market. Now, there would be more incentive to restrict this if you could make this kind of immediate jump from ordinary human to transhuman. But given that you're probably going to have small incremental steps, and in each case with each incremental step, there's going to be an incentive to offer this to a mass market as soon as the technology becomes profitable enough or viable enough. You probably won't get the nightmare scenario that you've outlined. It'll probably be a significantly softer landing than that. Now, how much softer depends on the specifics of the case, particular levels of technology, particular levels of economic development. You can't really say anything about these things a priori. But yeah, I given how technologies like this tend in practice to develop, and given the fact that it is profitable to offer things like this to a mass market, you probably won't have this kind of horrendous scenario. And I'm granting, for the sake of argument, that these things will be possible and so on. But yeah, I mean, I think we're kind of getting a recurring issue here, which is that you're contriving these very constricted examples. Whereas my point with economic dynamics is that there's a lot of openness to change and dynamism and flow and so on. So I don't know. I mean, you're kind of putting me in a box, is what I'm saying. And it's like, well, if I handcuff you, then you won't be able to use your hands. Well, Yes. You know what I mean? You know what I mean? It kind
Yeah.
of becomes like that sort of thing.
Okay, so fair point, but it's meant to illustrate that if the circumstances are especially constrained, libertarianism won't necessarily lead to this circulation of elites. If there's the right geographic circumstance, just the right technological circumstance, whatever it is theoretically possible for an elite group to kind of achieve liftoff and break away and go into a snowball effect. Maybe that if we started from a point of libertarianism, that would never arise, but not starting from libertarianism, maybe we have the conditions for the snowball. So do you accept that there are conditions under which this snowball could happen?
I accept that it's logically possible, sure. But the question for me is, how probable is it, given actually existing social dynamics and the sorts of things that we could expect to occur under a libertarian arrangement, economically, socially, and so forth. So it's a question of probability.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay.
So I guess my question would be, you require the mere possibility of this to be utterly excluded. And so my question is why? Why is it not sufficient, for example, to reduce the probability to some low, manageable level and accept that? Why do you insist on 0?
Well, because it's an unknown factor. If there is some positive value for this probability of basically, elite takeoff, let's call it that, or elite snowballing, if there's some chance that the world that we're living in now, even if we instituted libertarianism, is configured in such a way to lead to this snowball, then that means like 0 probability of a future for my progeny. It means my bloodline will be suppressed and gradually forced out, because it's not just economic incentives that are operative here, there are also evolutionary incentives. And if there's a chance that the ruling elite today had a design to reduce the population, push everyone else out of the game, and basically inherit the planet for themselves, then I would rather have a non-libertarian solution to that kind of problem than just institute libertarianism and see what happens. So because I don't know the value for this probability, I would, instead of looking to libertarianism, which runs into this objection that there is a possibility of elite snowball if you don't start from libertarianism, I would look to another kind of philosophy that doesn't run into that same issue, because the solution is built in, like distributivism, right? Like the idea that we do at some point divide up the land of the world, maybe gradually, maybe you find ways of doing it where you don't dispossess current property holders, but maybe you suspend inheritance in certain cases, etc. And then everything else can be free market on top of that, but there is this basic provision that you have living space. That's a kind of moral right, a natural human right, that I think is as palatable or as intuitively acceptable as the right to property, right? Because animals, so we're going to blend into a lot of different topics here, and there are many like technical issues to address, but I think animals do have rights to some degree, and I know you disagree there, but the kinds of rights that animals have are like, we don't drive species to extinction unnecessarily. We try to maintain biodiversity. We don't try to, be excessively cruel to animals when they are on our farms and such. But we accept that an animal can kind of have a right to its territory, that, okay, the animal didn't technically improve it. It didn't, gain property rights to its territory, but territory is more fundamental than property rights. If there was a entirely primitive human group that had no tools, never developed anything, they were just, maybe they lived in like Edenic conditions and never had to develop, but they historically had this territory that they occupied, and then I come in with some fencing and put up some borders and say this is my homestead now, I don't think that means I own it. I think their right to the territory, even though it's not their property strictly speaking, is something and is actually more fundamental than the right to property. So let's go in that direction. There was the other side of this initial objection that I wanted to get to, but we'll probably run into this at another point in the conversation. So let's move to this topic of right to territory.
Of right to territory. Okay, well, just a brief comment on what you were saying earlier about the probability of elite takeoff. To me, hearing this and accepting the strictures that you put on the example, to me this just says, well, then we need to institute a libertarian social order as quickly as possible, so as to minimize this. But I suppose that's just my angle of looking at this, and I would probably also appeal to similar situations like the immediate post-Soviet situation where they sort of attempted to privatize state property. And although there were problems, I mean, elites did use their connections to, circumvent the strictly libertarian situation. It's not difficult to imagine what would have happened if those principles had been adhered to. I mean, you wouldn't have this oligarchical class. But anyway, so down to the question of territory. Okay, so let's dig into the example that you used a bit deeper. So you have this primitive tribe, and they live under these Edenic conditions. Okay, this is what I want to dig into. You said Edenic conditions. Now, I assume you're using that term somewhat loosely. Like, you don't mean it literally in the sense of like no scarcity at all. Because if you meant that, there would be no sense in having property rights at all, because there wouldn't be even the possibility of conflict over them, right? So, I guess I need to drill down deeper to like understand certain like specific aspects of your situation. I mean, sure, you could have a primitive tribe that grows some agriculture on a land, or just like picks fruit from trees that grow naturally there, or whatever. Yeah, I mean, I do think that conveys a kind of property. Like, okay, here's a tree, an apple's growing there. You pick the apple, like, yeah, it's your apple. Like, assuming that the whole situation was unowned, yeah, okay, you homesteaded the apple.
But what about the tree and the land?
Well, the tree and the land. Well, and you're assuming that they do nothing with the land.
No, maybe they have taboos against it, right? It's part of their religion to never make tools. And they restrict their reproduction, so there isn't effective scarcity. There's always enough fruit on the trees for everybody.
It's hard to imagine how such people would survive. I mean, again, we're getting into the problem of a constricted, an overly constricted example where you're pointing out that once I'm handcuffed, I can't use my hands. I can, if you constrict the example enough, I'm happy to grant that the negative consequences that you allege or worry about would follow.
Yeah, let's look at the example of animals then. Okay, so you have a semi-intelligent hominid, more intelligent than a chimpanzee, but doesn't use language. Clearly has feelings and has a sense of ownership over its territory, even though it never homesteads it. Do I have a right to just walk into that society, put up a fence, and exclude anyone from access?
Well, wait a minute. Now we need to dive into the question of what constitutes homesteading. I don't have a labor mixture theory of property, by the way. This might be the source of confusion, because there's a vague idea of like what is labor and what counts as labor mixture. And then the Robert Nozick's famous example of like, if you spill your can of tomato juice into the ocean, do you own the ocean now, or have you just dissipated your tomato juice? I think you've dissipated your tomato juice. Like, I'm not a labor theorist when it comes to the appropriation of unowned property. I think you just have to do something that makes it intersubjectively clear to the other semi-intelligent hominids that like this is your plot of land. And like even animals do this. Like you'll have a dog marking its territory, and making it known to the other dogs that this is like that dog's area. So I don't know. I mean, I can certainly imagine a semi-intelligent hominid doing something to the land that would effectively qualify as appropriation or homesteading. So, yeah, I would just ask, like, what specifically do you have in mind? Because I don't see a problem with what you've described. I mean, I'm happy to allow that as like a straightforward example of homesteading.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Let's put it this way. Say you have an endangered species that has been kept in captivity, bred in captivity. Now, and maybe this is the same kind of semi-intelligent hominid species. Do you think that it would be moral to take these semi-intelligent hominids and just kind of cast them out into the economy? They have, 50 IQs, 40 IQs. They can't really even talk. But is it right to just kind of cast them out and say, okay, now provide for yourselves? Or do you feel that you have some duty and they have some right to land on which to live? Like, isn't that a kind of fundamental right that creatures have, a right to territory, not just property?
Well, I'm trying to like play with the example and toggle it a little bit, and let's take the example of just releasing an animal into the wild, right? Not even a semi-intelligent hominid, just a dog or a chimpanzee or whatever. Now, you could say that given that this animal had been raised in captivity, it's not used to living out in the wild and probably wouldn't get very far. And so you could say, well, I probably have a moral obligation to care for this thing. I'm willing to accept that. That's fine by me. But then when you then sort of increase the intelligence of the creature up to a scale, I mean, there is some point at which this thing would be able to fend for itself. It's just not clear where that is. And I don't have a hard and fast answer for you. I mean, this is the how many grains of sand does it take to generate a heap problem? It's a Socrates paradox. I don't have a definite answer as to how intelligent the thing must be in order to qualify for property rights, and I don't think that it has to be answered in a definite way in any particular instance. I mean, in any given libertarian society, there's going to be a significant portion of the social structure, the culture, even the law, that is just a result of custom. That's just a result of, the particular traditions of the society. How old do you have to be to drink? There's no like in principle answer that you have to be 18 or 21. It's fine if different societies set different age limits to that. I think you'd probably get a similar situation in regard to the example that you've described. I mean, some would allow it. Some would say that you have an obligation to care for whatever the thing is and provide it with territory or whatever it needs. And some would have a different reaction. I mean, this is really an example of every society can kind of do its own thing. I don't think this is something that libertarian theory per se can decide.
Right. Well, what I'm testing is how fundamental the right to property is, this libertarian ethical claim, versus the one that I'm putting forward as a right to territory as being actually more fundamental, applying to animals as well. Like, I would say that unrestricted human development of an area, even if no property rights are violated, can be immoral if it impinges on the traditional environment of animal species. I think you should protect habitat for animals, and the more intelligent the animal, the more important it is to protect their habitat, just because they can suffer more from habitat loss if they're more intelligent. So that there we're dealing with, it seems to me, just two different moral intuitions. I roughly accept the kind of account of property that you give, but I also believe, just morally speaking, that animals have a right to territory, not by virtue of anything they do, but just by virtue of the fact that they're alive. That's an intuition that I have, and I think people have similar intuitions. That's why they want to protect habitat for animals. So, why is my moral intuition and my moral claim there incorrect, and the claim to property rights correct?
Well, it's not necessarily incorrect. Again, we're talking about the degree of intelligence that the animal possesses. I've heard it said, and I guess this is a fairly decent statement of my own view on the matter, which is that I would be willing to grant rights to animals when they can, declare them, when they can claim them, and say, hey, I have rights. Now, this doesn't mean like write a treatise or anything like that necessarily, but demonstrate that you have some rationality, some capacity to kind of, I guess, grasp universals, participate in speech and sort of argumentative discourse or those kind of things. Now, for the animals that are not, I see them as resources that you have to care for as you would any other. I would point out, by the way, just empirically, when you look at things like lakes, for example, that have fallen under private ownership versus those that are owned by a state, where property rights are not clear, the animal life under the conditions of private ownership fares much better. More fish. The private owner has the incentive not to overexploit the resource and deplete the fish population, let's say, to the point where it's no longer usable and you can't extract resources from it. So his kind of economic considerations actually end up being harmonized with the long-run interests of the fish population that resides in the lake. I think that would be, you get pretty much the same result if you just talk about how to care for animals. There would also be some economic incentive, presumably because people like you place a value on caring for animals and their habitat, to do that kind of thing. I don't necessarily say, exploit everything ruthlessly and just, rape and pillage and destroy. Obviously it depends on the moral character of the society that you happen to inhabit. And when there are sufficient numbers of people like you, then even someone who doesn't feel as you do, if he owns a resource, he will have to take the kinds of moral considerations that you've mentioned into account, if for no other reason, just for his own economic self-interest.
That is an attempt at addressing the concern for the violation of the rights of animals, just saying like human compassion will lead to their beneficial treatment. But it doesn't, address the question which was really being asked, which was about this more fundamental set of rights than property rights. So, like, for example...
Okay, well, in that case, yeah. Why don't you explain what that is?
Well, we should define a right, I guess, and then work from there. So, a right, in my opinion, is something that if you violate that right, there will be long-run karmic consequences. I can't really address my genuine concept of a right without bringing in dharma, karma, the whole metaphysics and all that. Mm-hmm. But a right that someone has is something that if you violated it, you would face the consequences of natural law for violating it. Just like a law is a law. Well, it's not a law because of this, but if you violate a law, you will experience the punishment built into the law. So the rights that a person has are those things that if you violate them, there will be consequences. So in that way, I think animals have a right not to be molested, kind of unnecessarily harmed, because we need to eat. I think you can make the claim that it is within natural law to eat cows, to eat chickens, but
I can have my steak. Okay.
Yes, you can, but you can't torture the cow. That's not within natural law. I think that you would face karmic consequences if you were going around mutilating cattle. I would phrase that in my concept of rights as saying the cow has the right not to be unduly molested. I would also, lump in that right to territory into that. So, like, if you keep cows, I think it would be morally wrong to keep them in a confined space in the dark and just, pour in corn feed. I think that is immoral because the cow has its natural state of being, and you want to emulate that to the greatest extent possible, not just to raise, better grass-fed beef, although it does do that as well, but also because this is a right that the cow has. And the further you take an animal away, a creature away from its kind of natural setting by force, the more you're violating that animal's rights and the greater your moral consequence.
Okay, now here is my question. What happens in a situation where the right of an animal and the right of a human come into conflict? Let's say there's some cows, out to pasture on a piece of land, and they're said to have, a territorial right in that land, but there are also trees that, have fruit on them, and a starving person walks by and needs to eat. Or, that's a somewhat contrived example, but just generally speaking, what happens when a human right and an animal right come into conflict?
Well, if a course of action is within kind of the natural functions of the human being, like feeding himself, I mean, I would kind of class that under the kind of example where, you are starving and you run across like a food cart that's not being tended, but it's somebody else's food. And if you don't steal to eat, then you'll very likely die. Like, you're on the point of starvation. In that case, I don't think it's morally wrong, even though you're violating property rights. I don't think you're violating a true right there, because this is within your right to provide for yourself, right? So rights are defined in terms of deviance from this kind of dharma, natural law, whatever the genuine kind of inbuilt moral consequences are, metaphysically speaking. So it's hard to say, but if they genuinely overlap, like the conventional set of rights of a herd of cows and then the usual set of rights of a human being, if there is overlap, then the human should do whatever is in their natural set of functions, like the right to feed themselves, the right to eat one of the cows if need be, because that's part of this natural order, because it's built into the natural order. That's kind of how I think of rights.
Okay, well, I don't disagree with that. I think it's just, I think from a purely utilitarian perspective, if you just look at consequences and nothing else, our respective arrangements would probably have basically the same outcome in these sorts of cases. I mean, you look at it as the cows having a territorial right to their land, and I see it as, well, there's someone who owns these cows, right? And also the land on which they're out to pasture, and they have a resource. They are a resource, and he has an economic incentive to be as good of a steward of that resource as possible. So in actual fact, even though I'm not using this rights language, from a utilitarian perspective, the cows are probably going to be treated well. And in the case where a human right conflicts with these, cow rights or this aspect of how they live, I would say the same thing that you've said. So in practical terms, I don't think we disagree here.
Well, yeah.
The
term right
is you have this underlying metaphysics of karma and so forth that leads to this conclusion. I don't share that metaphysical scaffolding, but the practical conclusion, at least in this case, comes out to be the same. So I guess the real source of the disagreement is about the metaphysical scaffolding, but that's going to take us very far.
Yeah, we can't go there. There are other points to address. What is your definition of a right, though?
Okay. I guess a right would be anything which it is legitimate to use violence to defend. I guess, in practical terms. But then we get to the question of like what is legitimate, and that would also be defined in terms of, in terms of a right. Basically, I basically reduce all rights to property rights, and I outline the system of rules that I favor. So anything that conforms to that framework, then any purported claim of property ownership that conforms to that framework would be a legitimate claim, and therefore, if it's violated, you have the right to use violence to defend it, either directly or by delegating it to, someone else.
Okay. Well, something that you have a right to use violence to defend, or if your rights are violated, that entitles you to violence.
I should be more clear.
Okay.
I guess I don't really draw a distinction between property rights in particular and rights more generally.
Mm-hmm.
So that my definition of rights in the most general sense just collapses into the definition of property rights that I gave earlier.
Mm-hmm.
And you do draw this distinction. So,
well, property rights are just one category of rights, and rights are broader than property rights for me. Okay, I'm still not sure where the legitimating force of where the moral authority comes from in your concept of right.
Oh, okay. So what conveys a property right? What gives it its kind of moral grounding? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, not the efficient cause of someone having a property right, but what legitimates that right.
Well, imagine the consequences of a world where there are no property rights, where no one may legitimately make use of any resource. Right? We all starve, we all die, and that's it. Poof, the end. So the telos, the final cause of a property right, is the preservation of human existence and human flourishing. That it's something that contributes to the betterment and improvement of human nature, at least within a social context. It's not the only thing, but this is what it's ultimately designed to do, to enable us to, first of all, survive, but also to flourish, to expand our capacities in whatever way we find of interest to us that we can. Right.
But I guess, this would kind of get into moral realism versus anti-realism, and I'm not an anti-realist, but I'm tempted to give that side to undercut the account of rights that you're giving, because in my account, the rights are enforced by karma. There's the reality of it is in the consequences, and then you can deduce the nature of rights by looking at consequences long term, kind of empirically. Whereas for you, you're we could all kind of get behind the goal of rights as a construct if we're reasonable people, but then it's not really a fundamental right. It is a social convention, and then the collective of people agreeing to this generates the right. It's not something that was inalienably in the individual. How is it in the individual prior to us kind of all saying, yeah, that's a good convention for us?
Well, I think human nature is inherently social. It's part of who we are to live within the context of a social environment. We can't really fully realize our humanity without that. And so social convention is itself rooted in human nature. So it's rooted in that sense, in the sense that we're naturally social beings. So if in order to realize ourselves, in order to be most fully human in some sort of Aristotelian eudaimonic sense, we have to live within the context of a society, and then we have to face these problems of scarcity and resource allocation. Well, then as a technical fix to that, property rights emerge.
Mm-hmm. You could also, I could see it going in the direction that this right to territory also emerges. The need to have property rights, I accept, but then someone else might say that if you don't have this right to territory, then you could run into the problem of monopolistic cabals exploiting the underclass who has no meaningful prospect of social advancement. Now, I kind of accept that if we started from pure libertarianism, that situation would never arise. But we're just kind of going back to this possibility of elite snowballing. Like, I don't know how likely it is. Depending on how well organized the elite group is, it may not look like the conditions are met for this phenomenon, but they might have some master plan that they've concocted and put a lot of work into to ensure that the snowball goes forward. So that's the fear. It's why do we need an inalienable right to territory, just in case this snowball is rolling down towards us and we want to protect ourselves. I still don't see how the right to property has some like really hard and fast edge over the right to territory. And if you accept the right to territory in addition to the right to property, then you would get to more of a distributivist kind of philosophy like mine.
Well, this again comes down to like a basic metaphysical difference that we're probably not going to have time to explore. But to just put it very briefly, your approach to this seems to be from this kind of general notion of karma, whereas I'm highlighting the importance of like rational capacity, like specifically rationality, the ability to grasp universals. And I think that those creatures which do have that ability are sort of categorically distinct from those who do not, because property, the concept of property ultimately is legalistic. Like it's something, like law itself is a product of speech and human symbolic capacity and so forth. So you might have some notions of territoriality among animals, but property itself, which is a legal thing arising out of the human symbolic ability, or of the symbolic abilities of any other similarly constituted creatures that might exist anywhere in space, is just the important thing. So I guess that's what it comes down to. It comes down to my view of rationality and its importance and its telos, and then that placed within a human context, whereas you're looking at this in a more general sense. For you, it seems like there's more of a continuum between the non-rational and the rational, like the one kind of glides smoothly into the other, if hopefully I'm more or less understanding this correctly, whereas I'm drawing a more hard and fast distinction. At least that's how it seems to me.
Yeah, I probably do have more of a spectrum in mind. I think symbolic reference is distinct from animal modes of communication. So there is a functional distinction between language and communicative utterances of other species. But there is a kind of architecture of thought that is, I would say, the scaffolding onto which symbolic reference is grafted, and animals have that kind of thing. Like, for example, making reference to a class of phenomena with a specific memory, right? So when, for example, like the howler monkey hears the call that means there's a jaguar coming from the other people around, he doesn't interpret that symbolically. There's an image of a jaguar, perhaps a recollection that comes to mind, and then he responds and runs into the tree or wherever he goes. So yeah, I do think there's something of a spectrum, but there is also punctuated equilibrium where you have this point at which there's a new type of reference. It's a distinct kind of configuration of the information system. I don't know. I mean, it's structured differently. So I don't know how relevant this is for the moral point, which is that you're deriving rights from this kind of participation in the community of discourse, and I'm deriving it from a capacity to feel pain, a capacity for just experience in the first place. And I don't really, I don't get the intuition to ground concepts of rights fundamentally in rational capacity. Like that's that threshold. I don't really understand the grounds for that, like why this has to be the condition and no other for a being to have rights.
Well, if you think about the continuum from just non-living matter all the way up to something with rational capacity, you can imagine a continuum there. I mean, you can imagine sort of pre-rational animals with, as you said, some ability to feel pain or experience emotions and have like some kind of qualitative experience, and then lower than that, you can imagine atoms or like inert particles with inherent dispositions, and you can build up a metaphysical account of how, from the inherent dispositional properties of fundamental matter, once it's organized in a certain way, you get to use the Aristotelian term, the animal soul, and then up further at a different level of organization, the rational soul. So there is a kind of continuum there. But if you take the continuum as a whole, then it's not clear where you should draw the line separating what enables one to have rights or not. I mean, it would seem like you either declare some cutoff point, or you accept the continuum as a whole and you grant rights to everything. Like pebbles can have rights, and that seems a bit odd to me.
Well, okay, the application of rights doesn't have to be binary. Like the magnitude of the moral force of the right of a pebble may be very small. You can chuck it, if it gives you just a little bit of pleasure, you can chuck it into the pond, try to skip it. That's perfectly fine. So if there is this spectrum, I don't see the inherent absurdity of such a position. But yeah, I can't identify a hard cutoff point where suddenly rights emerge. I think rights... I mean, ultimately, the idea that a particular class of creatures has a particular set of rights is a bit of a heuristic, in my opinion. It ultimately, like, that individual has the rights they do due to their relationship with everyone else around them, right? Like, the moral consequences that come from interfering with a creature that factors in that creature's family, its way of life, its habitat, like its evolutionary history. It factors in all the auxiliary details. And so no two individuals will have precisely the same profile of rights, right? There's a specific way to treat each individual appropriately. There's a right way to treat everybody. And so in a way, everybody has a slightly different set of rights. That's my, another kind of complexity of the position. But yeah, so we've examined this. We hit the wall at metaphysics.
Just a quick question, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
If everyone's rights are at least slightly different, even granting that some class of beings like humans might have a closer association between their differences of rights than something else, you would need to harmonize all of this in a general legal system. Wouldn't you? So how would you harmonize those differences? You would just kind of like have that sort of scale be factored in at a kind of meta level. How would you do that?
Well, common law would be the way, and judges making individual determinations and then approximating the principles that come out of those determinations of justice through heuristically, case law, precedent. I mean, just the way the legal system handles things now, basically.
Okay, so there wouldn't be something like, someone with a 200 IQ can legally rob someone with an 80 IQ?
Probably not. I wouldn't exclude it, but...
Okay, I mean, right, because you're suggesting that there's a difference, and it seems wrong to allow that difference to be reflected in the law, at least in an extreme way. So that's what my question about harmonization is
right.
driving at.
Well, that's that's having to do with like the right way to set up a legal system, and there's something in it that's going to have to be heuristic. I don't view human legal systems as being identical to Dharma. You can't capture Dharma in a set of propositions, but you do your best to approximate it, which is why case law, that kind of stuff.
I think in actual fact that ends up converging on what I said earlier about, just cultural differences between various societies resulting in certain legal differences, even if you have a kind of broad skeletal kind of libertarian framework. So again, I don't think we disagree all that much in terms of practical consequence.
Except that I'm a distributivist, and I would, divide up the land of the earth and ensure from here on that every human being has some piece of territory to call their own, so that they can't be, if the circumstances are right for it, they can't be coerced into a lifestyle that degrades them, demeans them. I don't think people should ever be kind of coerced into employment. I think the baseline should be like subsistence level agriculture. That should be achievable. And right now it's far from achievable, right? I mean, do you think that I don't know. I guess this is partly like to do with the concept of the social contract too, because in order to meaningfully submit to some kind of social convention and join the broader society, like you have to be doing it from a place of liberty already. You have to be in some sense free in order to make a meaningful consent. Like, a contract under duress isn't meaningful. And I see a lot of the ways that people participate in society as being under duress. If, the consequence is starvation if you don't do this. I think those kind of circumstances, ideally they would never arise in a libertarian world, but it hasn't been a libertarian world. There are many, particular local contexts and in different states, in different ruling elites, that may result not necessarily in this kind of worst case elite snowball where they just take over everything, but may result in power differentials that mean that employers have unjust leverage over employees, and in a particular place for a particular person there's just no meaningful way out, no option out. I think you should always have some kind of option out of the social system, and so I think providing that as a baseline is important. But let's, on this same kind of note, another advantage of having this baseline saying you have a right to some basic territory, and maybe we can conceive of it as a property right, rather than just basic territorial right, but it would be that if automation, AI, etc., results in mass job loss, and for whatever reason, our optimistic predictions about new jobs being created don't come to fruition, then there is some basic income that people can be provided with, because you could lease out your allotment of land, you could have something, or you could work it yourself. There is something inalienably tied to the individual that would prevent them from falling into abject poverty and complete dependence on a system that could, in principle, be structured in a way where there is no meaningful way out, where they are coerced into participation.
Okay, so a few questions. The first thing that occurs to me is just on the property rights theory that you're kind of implicitly driving at. If everyone is to have some minimal allotment of land or whatever it is, what happens if let's say you have, I don't know, multiple children? You're like a JF style fanatic about propagating your genes. Is your allotment of land to be? I mean, how is it to be divided amongst your children? I mean, I guess you could work that out in your will or what have you. But if you extend this process out, doesn't this kind of get to a situation where you get increasingly smaller and smaller parcels?
Yes. And that would be built in as a way of controlling the population and resource consumption, so that, I mean, beyond any other behavior, having more children, giving rise to new people, is going to produce more pollution than you can produce in your own lifetime. So there is a cost, I think, to the earth as a whole for every life, every human life especially. We consume a lot of energy. We put a lot of pollutants out into the world by virtue of our being. And so it also has, I see this as a benefit, that it provides an incentive not to breed out of control, where your bloodline will have an easier job if it's been responsible in reproduction. So now that's just my moral claim, and I don't believe that everyone would accept that as like completely just, But also, like, the way that this kind of global distributivism would come about would not be by getting everyone to agree to it. It would be, having a breakaway elite that just creates it as the state of things and enforces it. So, because in that way, I'm not a libertarian. Such a scenario would require coercion to be enforced. But then I don't necessarily care about that. I think there are circumstances in which it's okay to coerce someone for their good or for the greater good. I don't shy away from that kind of, ethical calculus. So, yeah, the objection that you raise, I see that as a benefit of this kind of distributivism.
Okay, because as I look at this, if you had this distributive system in place, and then after a few generations, the property allotment of each person would shrink, there would eventually come a point where it would be better to just kind of, reshuffle this, and so that land use could be consolidated in various ways and reallocated to more productive use for everyone's ultimate benefit. But again, as you say, you kind of want this Malthusian scenario to occur as a control over population. Okay, this gets to another thing, and these really are technical questions about like resource production and things of that sort. But I've noticed this in discussions with you that you view resources as in the way that an engineer might. That is, you look at them purely as kind of like physical objects, and that their relevant properties are their physical properties, like the chemical properties of, say, oil, or the nitrates in land that make it able to, that sort of thing. I view resources in a different way, in that I see a resource as not just a physical thing, but also a functional concept. And so what is a resource is it's not just a function of the physical properties of whatever you're looking at, but also the, how do I put this? Well, the state of technology, for instance. I mean, prior to the discovery and the ability to exploit petroleum technologically, it was viewed as a waste product. It wasn't a resource. So what is or is not a resource depends on your technological capability. Now, something I've become a pretty big booster of recently is nuclear power, because the energy benefits of it, if it were properly implemented, would just be enormous. I mean, especially if you actually allowed research in nuclear fusion to proceed, especially given that in what was it, 1994, there was a reactor that actually achieved break-even capacity, and it was like we were almost at cold fusion. It's crazy. I mean, if you actually achieved that, you would have enough energy, and given that energy is kind of a master resource, you would therefore have generally high standards of living, where I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility to imagine that you could have many times more people living on the globe that currently do, while they all enjoy substantially higher living standards than they in fact enjoy.
Right.
So,
well,
the carrying capacity of the Earth is not fixed, in that human ingenuity can expand it and has been expanding it.
But if that happens, the thinner slices that you receive from whoever originally got that one land credit, the thinner slices would do more. So
yes,
yeah,
so that would be a solution to the problem. That would be a solution to the problem of the kind of Malthusian constraint on the population. I bring all that up because I don't know. I mean, I think that there should be as many people on Earth as there are, and you should have as many children as you'd like to have. I'm laissez-faire on that score, unsurprisingly, I suppose. But but no, I think that humanity has demonstrated a capacity to generate technological innovations and allow the Earth to support more people.
But there has to be a breaking point. I mean, it's only so large. Past a certain point, all the people wouldn't fit.
Well, that's true, but I mean, there are other. I mean, you can imagine, space travel, lunar colonies, depending on how sci-fi you want to get.
Yeah.
But
right. So that is I wanted to go to space, but not yet. So let's stay on Earth for now, and think more about some of these problems that we've mentioned with technology. And you've probably heard me use this objection before to nationalism, and I've used this as my number one argument for some kind of global system of government. I do think that a global system of government will ultimately be necessary, mainly for this reason, that we never know what the full impacts will be of some given technology. Nick Bostrom used this analogy. It's like every new technology is pulling a ball out of a hat, and it's either, a blue ball or a black ball. And maybe there are only a couple black balls in there, but once you pull that black ball, you've grabbed a technology, the consequences of which, long run, end up being highly detrimental, maybe even kind of suicidal at the scale of humanity. And so because of that, then we have to have a way of looking out into the future at the implications of technological development, rather than just kind of implementing any technology on the off chance that it is for the greater good. For example, say you're a pharmaceutical company in a libertarian society, and you are working on experimental kind of gene therapy medication, and there's a very, very low probability of producing something that will kind of spread through the human population and lead to mass death. But there's a much greater probability that everything will be fine and you'll make a profit. The deterrent of being sued isn't really what's at stake there. If there's even a 0.00001% chance that this medication is structured in such a way that it could break out, spread through the population, and render everyone infertile, or who knows what would happen with some of these experimental gene editing technologies.
Not that any gene editing technology would ever make you infertile. I mean, let's not say that.
Yeah, that's I don't know where this example is coming from, but just suppose that such a scenario existed. How do you address, from a libertarian perspective, this general problem that we never know the full implication of technologies, and sometimes it's worth the risk for the producer of a technology, for the possible upside, to risk downsides beyond just them getting sued. The downside for some technologies could be we destroy the ecosystem, we do things that are irreparably damaging to the future of the species. How do you control technological development to avoid that downside in a libertarian world?
Well, I answer the objection by agreeing first that yes, technologies can have unintended and unpredictable consequences, but it does not follow from this that state action is required to bring that under control, or even that it successfully could bring it under control, nor does it follow that state action does not have its own unpredictable risks that we can't chart. I mean, we all know plenty of examples of government policies generating all sorts of unintended consequences. I mean, just one that happens to be floating around in my head right now, China's one-child policy, which they advocated as something important to control population, and now they're facing a demographic time bomb and are scrambling to undo what they've done. First allowing 2 children, then 3, now as many as you want, and I don't think it'll take long before they will start penalizing people for not having children. So, so they've run into trouble that way. So I don't think that you can just assume that state intervention in an effort to mitigate risk doesn't carry its own risks.
Right.
And it's not immediately obvious that those risks, the risks associated with state intervention, wouldn't be greater than the risks that they're ostensibly intended to mitigate.
Right.
In fact, there's probably reason to think that the state, the risk proceeding from state intervention could be greater. As I mentioned earlier, the purpose of a state basically is to generate an elite class that's insulated from feedback. Now, if you're worried about things like nuclear proliferation or viruses escaping from labs, not that that's ever happened, if you're worried about these things, then Well, first you have to just stoically accept that some level of risk of even the kinds of things that you talk about is going to exist, and just as a matter of living in the real world, you will never crush this utterly. Like on some level, you can do things to mitigate them, of course, but you're just not going to get it to zero. That's something you just have to swallow. So the question then becomes, how do we keep it at its lowest, at the lowest point we can get it to? And it seems to me that if you empower a state, if you empower an organization to marshal vast resources from society, to tax, and thereby to insulate itself from feedback in the way that states do, and allow this accumulation of errors, allow this elite class to emerge that's basically, that basically receives the same income and prestige regardless of performance, really, barring something like a revolution. So, I mean, it's not that there's absolutely no feedback mechanisms on a state, but they function poorly, certainly relative to something like the profit and loss test of a private firm. So it seems to me that if you empower such an organization with the ability to regulate things like nuclear weapons or viruses, etc., its power and its ability to insulate itself from feedback presents its own risk. And it's not clear to me that that risk is lower than the risk of just, letting things go in a totally kind of free libertarian situation. So right. I don't accept the premise of the argument that the risk can be pushed down to zero. It's just what's greater or lesser.
Right. And any old state configuration is not guaranteed to mitigate that risk or decrease it. It may well increase it. The claim is that my position is that there's one way to correctly organize the planet, and it's not multiple states. It is one master society that is absolutely transparent, like Plato's Guardians, where there are strict standards for entering and getting into higher positions, and you're just literally monitored 24/7 if you want to occupy that position. So you're a public citizen. We all see what you're doing, and whether you ascend the ranks or descend is always determined by quantifiable performance metrics. And this kind of managerial technocratic elite would. The alternative here is you have one society that is meant to regulate technological development at a global scale that is rationally organized. And it has one scheme for doing this. There are several ways of achieving it, but you could, for example, make technologies like CRISPR that could pose a threat inaccessible to anyone outside of this kind of monitored scientific class, so that it's never being done out in the sea, out in the wilderness, outside of our observation. You keep track of these materials and make sure that average people never have certain technologies, and that there aren't competing research labs out there. Science would have to be built into this kind of master society as an open scientific society where the facilities for research are always available, but you have to kind of give up the freedom of doing whatever you want with them, and be subject to the scrutiny of the open scientific community. I think that would be the way to go, and you could mitigate breakthrough technologies in different places of the world by basically just suppressing the ability for any other institution than this one kind of mass planetary research body to look into those things. Now, the cutoff, what do you allow people to have and what has to be within the supervision of the guardians, that would have to be determined by that said guardian class. So maybe it seems really far-fetched and kind of sci-fi, this kind of planetary arrangement, but the advantage is there is a possibility of one uniform solution around the world, that solution could work or it could not work, right, in the most basic sense. Whereas in a libertarian world, each time there's the possibility of running up against some potentially devastating technology, it's up to the people involved. There are billions of different solutions through time, always a new way of tackling these challenges, and that creates more opportunities for failure. Now, granted, if the global state makes a critical error, but if one lone researcher researching the wrong technology who lets the wrong thing out, one lone researcher could also pose a threat to the planet as a whole. So it's not so asymmetric. Like, that's always the kind of retort that you could offer, is you want power decentralized because if the central power fails and it's monopolistic, then that's catastrophic. It's not a resilient system. But this kind of problem of regulating technological development, both sides, massively decentralized and massively centralized, could result in human extinction. It's just which one has more of a chance of preventing it. I think this kind of global, open technocracy, scientific ruling elite would be more likely to prevent runaway technologies.
Okay, well, you've sort of predicted the general tenor of the response that I'm going to make. When you said, well, if the world state makes an error, the error is going to be catastrophic. Of course, you do have to ask things like, okay, the guardian class that are going to be under constant supervision, who will be supervising them? And those supervisors, wouldn't they be the true ruling class in that they are able to supervise the guardians? There's the buck has to stop somewhere, is what I'm saying. And wherever that is what the ruling class happens to be. Now, as far as the world state, I think there are great reasons to think that there'd be enormous risk of something catastrophic being developed in these state labs. Not that anything has ever been developed in Chinese state-owned virological labs. I would never suggest such a thing. But not that has ever happened. But also, I mean, the way that you're framing the question is that you're taking an event like the developing of a biological weapon or a nuclear weapon or some, gray goo or something catastrophic. You're taking this as a kind of homogeneous event, and so the way you're thinking about it is that in a decentralized world where potentially anyone has access to these things, the number of these events increase, and so given that they're basically individually homogeneous, the probability that at least one will result in catastrophe is greater.
Yeah.
Now, I don't see these as homogeneous events.
What do you mean by homogeneous events?
Well, what I mean is that one person working in his garage on some gene editing is basically the same as another, or that they're kind of uniform. Let me explain.
Okay.
It's like one coin flip is basically the same as another. They're uniform events, but I don't think that these events are uniform in that sense. I think that there's clearly human action and intervention that goes into this that kind of changes their character. So you can put measures into place to mitigate viral outbreaks or nuclear proliferation. And if you're in a decentralized situation, the consequences of that would be pretty severe, not just in that you would, lose capital value if you're some large enterprise, but you'd become a social pariah, clearly, mm-hmm. right?
Yeah.
And everyone would dissociate with you and do whatever they could to sort of, mitigate the damage that you'd caused. Whereas if you're a state and you do something like this, well, the perceived obligation to continue paying your taxes remains. So a private actor who might have designs on something like this is going to operate under constraints that states don't operate under. If you design a weapon and it leaks out and you're a state worker, oh well, you still get paid the same, basically, because people still believe in the obligation to continue paying taxes. And so there's no incentive for you to control yourself.
Yeah. Okay. That's a good point. So first of all, the global guardian society won't be based on taxation. The guardians will pool their land credits and have their kind of guardian islands where their society operates. But anyway, so yeah, the problem of incentive for the state, I think is addressed in my example, where each individual in that guardian society, if they're engaged in that scientific research, is going to be accountable, because there'll be video footage of everything that they're doing. It will be publicly accessible. There will be like systems in place to make the activity of the guardian class eminently available. So that also addresses the kind of first who guards the guardians question.
Well, how? I mean, let's say some guardian is up to something nefarious, and when you look for video footage of whatever he was doing, oops, it's disappeared. You know, it's been deleted from the database. You know, I mean, there is that kind of, you know, CYA.
I think. You know? I think there will be technological solutions to that. I imagine that technologies like blockchain will be able to provide resilient record keeping for an organization like that. As far as like how do you avoid cameras being tampered with, etc., those are all technical questions that would best be addressed kind of ex hypothesi by the kind of society that I'm talking about, right?
Okay, yes. I don't just mean the strictly technical question. I mean the question of some guardian actively works to sabotage this and cover up what he did. Who will hold him accountable?
Well, the other guardians and the public, which has access. Like, when did he formulate this plot? The idea is, I mean, some people would consider this dystopic, but I think it's necessary for a ruling class to be fully transparent, where you have records of all of their communications. So he would have to plan this whole thing in his mind, never exhibit behaviors that lets anyone off, and then somehow be smarter than everyone else who set up this technological system of mutual surveillance.
Okay, so I mean, I understand that in a technical sense, it might be possible to implement the mutual surveillance system. My question, though, is why would any ruling class ever agree to this? You know.
Yeah, well, just like Orwell, there's always a kind of competition between different ruling elites. The idea is this guardian class. I am imagining that it's built up from the bottom with societies that are run on these sorts of principles, scaled around the world until they have kind of a de facto parallel global system in parallel to all various nation states of the world. And then once they reach that critical threshold, they flip the switch. And it's just like in Orwell, the one class got the leg up and then rigged things so that the jostling would end forever. So that's kind of the idea, is that right now we don't have an open scientific technocracy, but we do have good-hearted, truth-seeking people who want a society ruled by reason. And I think if those people around the world learn how to cooperate and network using, the technologies we just mentioned, and scale that to a certain extent, then they would be in a position to then kind of just transition global economic and political activity within their system past a certain point. The details, I don't know. I mean, you'd have to kind of run that experiment and see. But the idea wouldn't be for an existing ruling elite to convert to this way of doing things, but the advantage would be there for scientific-minded, philosophically-minded, truth-seeking people to cooperate to institute this kind of structure. And I don't know, I don't see it as an insurmountable challenge, the incentives involved. I think there are enough idealistic people that would want to kind of join that kind of guardian order. There's always going to be somebody who has a pure commitment to scientific investigation, philosophical investigation, and if there's a place that is open to entry for them, they simply will show up and contribute. I think the incentives are there for good-hearted, truth-seeking, philosophically minded people to get involved in something like that.
So I guess then my next question would be that, in what ways is the guardian class analogous to state elites? Now, you've said that they're not, that their work isn't going to be funded by taxation. Mm-hmm. So in what sense are we even talking about a state here anymore, really? What sort of political organization is this? Like, what are the principles underlying the political organization? Because it doesn't seem to me that you're really talking about a state anymore. And if you aren't, if you're just talking about this community of researchers that maybe doesn't even necessarily agree mutually to put all their behavior out in public, but that has it so revealed and so displayed because of some blockchain fix, whether they like it or not, in order to keep them honest. That's fine as far as it goes. But I think if you do implement that, unless I'm not understanding something, then the result is something that's not really even what I would call a state anymore.
Yeah, I think the monopoly on force is what would make it a state. You wouldn't, because they would coercively restrict anyone outside of their system from developing certain technologies or from having certain weapons, right? Only the academy can have the nukes, I guess.
Okay. Okay. In that case, what about the following situation? Some guardian, lies about something, covers up some scientific project, and let's say it is revealed. Right? Let's say it's clear that this was done. But the guardians maintain their coercive power, their monopoly. So what's to prevent them from just being like, yeah, we lied, we created a bioweapon, who cares? Like, what are you going to do about it, basically?
Well, if the individual does that, then he would be punished within the justice system of the guardian class. If the class as a whole turned, well, I mean, that's where this kind of everyone, the panopticon model of guardian society comes in, because we would have access to all of the conversations that would lead to that kind of mass corruption. Like you couldn't, it couldn't sneak up on you, because every time the guardians are talking to one another, this is a matter of public record.
Well, yes, I'm willing to grant that it would be a matter of public record. I'm just saying that even if people know that they're corrupt, if they maintain a monopoly on power, couldn't they just be like, yeah, we're corrupt, we don't care, like, we have power, we're going to make bioweapons, we're going to do what we want because we have a monopoly on violence and you don't, and yeah, that's basically it. Just kind of rule in a direct, kind of brutal fashion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, so you're asking if the citizens or the civilians notice that something is going awry, the corruption is starting to creep in, then wouldn't the state be in a kind of position to disregard whatever the people have to say about it? Well, there you would have to rely on the kind of guardian class governing itself, and if it's available for anyone to enter, then you can always kind of go into the system, and since it's meritocratic, the way that it's structured, you can get into a position of influence yourself and make change yourself. The idea that the entire guardian class kind of simultaneously becomes corrupted, ignores the will of the people, I guess it would technically be possible, but also like this whole structure of life is based on the idea that it is possible to inculcate morality through a particular kind of lifestyle. So when I imagine the guardian lifestyle, I mean, the things that Plato talks about, like necessary training from a young age, particular types of disciplines, mathematical training, and the whole set of these behaviors, that would be what you rely on to maintain the goodwill and good intentions of the guardian class. I mean, what I guess here you're getting into like a psychological principle, where what is it that leads to corruption in an individual mind? If we're supposing that it's just like a spontaneous development out of the individual, then sure, it would always remain a possibility. But if evil always has a cause, like if corruption is a result of an imbalance of our different faculties, like say you let appetite get out of hand and that's the seed of this corruption, then the challenge is structuring the way of life of the Guardians to never allow this imbalance to get off the ground. So for this to really work, it also not just has to be a scientific elite, technocratic elite, but also a spiritual elite that is where it's actually an effective system for inculcating virtue. Now, granted, yes, if that's not possible, if we can't get a science of like spiritual goodness at the same time as this kind of open scientific elite, then it would likely be corrupted eventually. And then, okay, you have one global system with all the weapons and it's corrupt. Now what? Well, I suppose what would happen is that elite class would just kind of, I mean, worst case scenario, replace everybody else, get rid of everybody else, inherit the earth, and then you start from scratch there. So yeah, it would not necessarily be possible to have this uncorrupted unless it is like some kind of fundamental spiritual science is worked out. I know I'm asking for a lot of kind of concessions in even imagining this scenario, and I know it seems unrealistic, but the alternative is like, okay, so we have many different private labs all around the world researching all sorts of technologies all the time. Who knows which one is going to blow up the earth? You know, people are maybe researching things having to do with the earth's magnetic field, and they run some experiment like Tesla wanted to do, and, you know, siphon all of the energy, the seismic energy out of the earth, channel into something, and the earth splits in half. Like, we don't know what kinds of capacities might come out of some technologies, and curiosity is a powerful thing. And so it remains the fact that if technological progress goes uninhibited and anyone can research anything, that, I mean, it seems just to be a matter of time before somebody makes a mistake with a sufficiently advanced piece of technology, and that results in extinction. So yeah, I wouldn't say that my solution is perfect, but at least it has the potential, if certain technological and spiritual things are worked out, it has the potential to be a more resilient protection against these sorts of technological threats. But that kind of reminds me of the next point about kind of the interplanetary scale. Because if we can, do you want to go into outer space now or stay on Earth and address this real quick? To what you said. Yeah, you go ahead.
Okay. Well, I guess the crux of my disagreement with you comes down to this. I am not optimistic about humans' capacity to behave themselves unless they are subjected to consequences for not doing so. Mm-hmm. And the whole problem with a state elite is that the state environment, the state form by its nature, insulates an elite class from consequence. Now, you mentioned that there would be this kind of automatic system where the communications of the Guardian class would be public, but there's still the problem that I'm assuming that under the system of organization that you favor, there's going to be this obligation among the public to obey the Guardians. So, I mean, shouldn't there be a point where if you misbehave enough, then you're not entitled to the allegiance of the public anymore, and they can kind of, you know, push you out? Mm-hmm. I mean, that, you know, that at the very least there needs to be some kind of feedback mechanism, some kind of adjustment mechanism.
Joining yourself en masse. If the people are not happy, okay, then you join. You join and get into this position of authority, and then you can change things.
Well, okay, and you also said that membership in the Guardian class is completely open to everyone.
Yeah.
Now, the decision about who to allow into the Guardian class has to be made by someone, right? Mm-hmm. So who makes the decision?
Okay, so the idea would be that everyone at every scale is able to bring something to the table for the Guardians. That's why it doesn't have to be based on taxation. If you know that you don't have scientific acumen, you can go in and, you know, be a serf with your allotment of land and provide food for the Guardians. Or you can go in and be a mason and build their buildings, and, you know, at various scales. So it's absolutely open in the broadest sense, But in order to rise through the ranks of that technocratic system that's organized, who makes the decision is determined by the structure of that system. Just like the military, like who gets to what rank? Well, there are a bunch of rules in place, and that's what you would have to do. And that system of rules would have to evolve as theory evolves, and you'd have to kind of just, converge on best practices over time, and do the best that you can to structure your technocracy intelligently. And you would want like checks and balances to make sure that you don't have too much innovation. And these are all technical challenges that we have precedent for in existing organizations, and we've figured out how to do a lot of these things. And such a kind of enlightened scientific class would know about all of those examples from history. They would probably base a lot of their structure on historical examples, and then try to kind of iteratively improve that structure as things go forward in time.
So what portion of this entire organizational scheme is dependent on human will, and what portion of it is kind of automated? You know what I mean? Like if in how many cases, or in what percentage of the time is it that some decision has to be made, either to promote someone higher up in the Guardian class, or to remove someone for corruption, or to undertake some research project, or whatever it is? What proportion of those decisions come down to a mere kind of human declaration, and what proportion are just strictly automated? Because I can imagine a situation where there's a certain list of, say, prohibited research programs, and if you engage in them and the public record system on the blockchain reveals this, you're basically like automatically stripped of your guardianship credentials, like your key card into the house that you live in stops working, or something like that. So I can imagine that, and if you like sort of purely automate that, you can ensure a reasonably good circulation of the Guardian class, where you allow good people in, remove bad people, and so forth. But to the extent that these decisions are just based on human will, that will inhibit that process. So what proportion, is allocated to what here?
Yeah, I think you have to resort to a similar kind of, individual judges, individual case law, individual customs of the particular Guardian community that's present, and automate to the extent that's possible. I mean, what you're asking is kind of to like solve the equation ahead of time for what is actually the best balance of pragmatic restrictions and limitations of the circumstance, and then like in an ideal world, this is how things should go. And things are always messy, and so you do need individuals making certain calls, because automated systems don't seem to have the ability to adapt as well as individuals who use their own judgment. So, I mean, I can't really answer that question ahead of time, but...
Right, I understand. But the point of the question is that if it were somehow feasible to automate everything and ensure a kind of seamless circulation, then at least within the context of the Guardian class, you would have something that I think functionally would be the same as the, I guess you might call them like invisible colleges of scientific researchers that you might have in Ancapistan, where there's no formal centralized organization, but everyone pursues their own research programs, and then you write papers, and those papers spread, and others within the community of scientists who are competent to understand what you're doing evaluate you, and you just have this kind of natural evolutionary mechanism. And you don't have like, tenure or paywalls behind journals or all these other kinds of things that restrict circulation. So functionally, I think the result from a utilitarian perspective would probably be the same there. It's just, for me, the question is the number of things that do come down to judgment calls will then present wedges for stymieing the circulation process and enabling for the entrenchment of an elite. You find corruption finds a way to get a foot in the door, so to speak.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, I guess look to militaries and how they deal with promotions. Most of it is effectively automated, but like in final calls, or at the top of a field, there isn't always a precedent for the particular situation. Like for example, if an individual soldier does some exceptional heroic deed and they deserve merit for this, they deserve to be promoted. Well, no automated system is going to be able to capture the bravery of that individual and their contribution. So that's where the judgment of higher ups has to be used to kind of make this exception in this circumstance. Also at the top of the ranks, whether someone is performing well as a general is going to be harder to determine than whether someone's performing well as a private, because the functions of a private are all very well defined, and you can like do your room inspections and you can check all of that they're doing everything they're prescribed to do. But at the top of pyramids like that, people have to exert more agency, they have to be more creative, and then qualitative judgment becomes necessary because there just aren't enough known quantifiable factors for evaluation. Like on the margins, human judgment has to be present, or else the system can't adapt and build new law.
Oh, okay. I accept that. It's just then the question becomes: are there consequences for bad judgment? And if there's some way to administer those consequences, even to those at the very top of a field, then I think that just functionally comes out to the same result that you'd get in Ancapistan.
Yeah. So if the society could be engineered appropriately, I guess the main difference between this and Ancapistan is that this guardian society, for the good of mankind, decides that we are not allowing anyone else to develop these technologies. They're going to be within our system. If you want to work on them, you can come in our system and work on them where we're going to watch you. But you can't have them yourself. So that's this violation of libertarianism that for me addresses the threat of technological development, potential downsides there, and also I'm ready to go into outer space if you are. So the issue is that long run. Okay, so long run, if why don't states go full scale nuclear war here on Earth? Because we share the planet, and that would mean that all of us go extinct. But once you get off the same planet, the shared externalities aren't there to limit ambitious, aggressive behavior on the part of state actors. So if you have, China planet, if you have a planet, say you have it starts off as we're libertarians when we leave the Earth, but then when this one group gets to some planet in a distant solar system, gradually over time, they degrade from a libertarian way of life, and they eventually have this kind of planetary tyranny, and this tyrant has the ambition of building the galactic empire, and they want to build the Death. I use the same example with Joel Davis, and I think he kind of swept it aside because too sci-fi, I suppose. But I think it's a relevant concern. Is libertarian resilient enough to then spread out into the galaxy, colonize the galaxy, and prevent each one of these individual isolated planetary systems from developing into a tyranny, developing planetary, devastating kind of Death Star capacities, and then, going full scale imperial conquest on the galaxy as a whole, and potentially blowing up whole planets and things like that. I don't see any way of avoiding that eventuality unless before we leave the planet, we already have a unified system that mitigates threats, that prevents certain technological development, that keeps the peace between different regions. Like if, say, the Guardian Society decides to then branch out and start these other exosolar colonies, then it can regulate those colonies effectively. Whereas in a libertarian world, once they're gone, who knows what they turn into? And we know that human nature is corruptible. We know that not all planets are libertarian, including this one, right? So how do you address that kind of long run concern? For me, interplanetary peace is only possible if unification politically happens on Earth first.
Well, I mean, with some minor modifications, you can take the interplanetary case and actually bring it down to Earth. Like, imagine if every country had some like force field that made it, I don't know, impervious to a nuclear strike or something.
Okay.
Then it effectively you can recreate the example. Now, the problem ultimately that I have with the existence of a world state is that it's the ultimate rogue state. Like there's no escape from it other than going off of Earth and colonizing some other planet. We discussed in the discussions I had with you earlier about the history of liberalism that the reason why this philosophy originally emerged in the Middle Ages is because of how decentralized Europe was. There was no single center of authority that could monopolize everything. So now you're proposing like various kinds of technical fixes to sort of circulate elites out of the global organization, and sort of prevent corruption in that way. Now let's say someone goes off to work on some scientific project that they don't and they don't want to be part of the Guardian class because they find it stifling or something that the Guardians won't allow. So I mean, I guess what you'd say in response to that is that the world state or whatever it is will attack this person and shut them down. But the Guardian class is going to have technologies at its disposal. I don't buy the idea. I don't think it's realistic to think that that they won't use the power that they have for their own interests if there's no check on them. But if the checks are such that they can be automatically circulated out, you don't have anything that looks like a state anymore. Now, as far as the interplanetary case goes, you can basically transpose that onto the interplanetary situation. But now, as far as would I be able to prevent some planet from turning into a tyranny and becoming imperialistic? No, but then you get a technical sort of military question of how well will the tyrannical planet fare against a libertarian army. And there are all sorts of factors that go into this, plenty of intangibles, not just the general level of wealth. And a libertarian society would be extremely wealthy and therefore able to produce, weapons cheaply and so on. So it would have an advantage over a more restricted society in that sense. But there are other things like will to fight and so forth. So would a libertarian society be able to effectively resist such a tyranny? Would it be able to quell its imperialistic ambitions? Well, you can look at examples like, the Soviet Union or the United States in Afghanistan. They fought these, ragtag militias with no central organization. And the fact that these groups lacked a central organization actually was advantageous to them because there was no single area that you could conquer where you could say, okay, now we've beaten the Taliban. Because it's just a constellation of local warlords, and even if you defeat one, the others don't care. The others continue to fight you. Whereas if you have a formal war between two states and the one takes the capital of the other, it's over, right? So that sort of centralized structure provides a central point of failure. And also, I mean, large centralized military bureaucracies do tend to be these kind of lumbering behemoths that don't function especially efficiently. I mean, the Pentagon is, just as an example, rife with corruption. Military contractors, make deals with the government and sort of set prices unilaterally, and so you get absurd situations where the government ends up paying, $400 for a little pin that you put inside of a rifle. That really happened, by the way. So they're you don't control costs. These various kind of organizational problems that would lead a libertarian armed force to have an advantage, at least other things being equal, like if we assume parity between the size of the force and so on. So, I mean, I can't predict with 100% certainty that every libertarian army will always defeat every, tyrannical state, but I can point to certain advantages in organization that they would have. Um,
Well, okay. What if the realities of interplanetary warfare are such that the um, ability to produce world-destroying technologies is trivial, right? And it actually very well may be. All you have to do is get a really big rock and send it on the appropriate trajectory, and out of the blue, here comes this world-ending comet or meteor. So if that's the case, then what restrains a tyrant or someone who wants to go out and conquer other planets? It isn't the technical ability. It's really just the kind of morality of whether they're willing to do it, whether they think it's the right thing to do. The technical challenges may not be severe. It may be relatively easy to send out a cascade of these kind of asteroids to your enemies.
well, if it's relatively easy, then that actually creates a deterrent effect. You send an asteroid toward my planet, okay? I'll send one to yours then.
Right, but say that you're this one planet. You have the tyrant is in charge, and he's also like a cult leader that has this idea that the galaxy is destined for the chosen people of this one and only planet. They're meant to inherit the galaxy, and at the current time, there are 90 other planetary colonies. Well, maybe it's within the range of possibility to send 90 different world-ending meteors to these colonies, and it's like the nuclear option where you can get away with it before your enemy even knows it's coming, right? Like, that might be a tactical reality or a strategic reality of interplanetary conflict. I don't know if it is, but if it is, then no amount of efficiency in your economic system is going to prepare you for a giant space rock coming in, hurtling at your colony, right?
Well, if you want to go with this contrived example, let's say you have the cult leader and he's got, absolute power to send planet-destroying rocks towards whichever planet he likes. How would the World Federation, the Galactic Federation, or whatever it is you're proposing, how would this be able to stop the cult leader? I mean, couldn't he just use his weapons against the galactic force as well? I mean, if he's that powerful, right?
Well, the same guardian system would be put in charge of every planet. It would be the same governing class across each planet.
So the cult leader wouldn't emerge in the first place.
Yeah, you're looking out for such leaders ahead of time.
And if the guardian class on a particular planet goes rogue and becomes cult leaders,
well, the technical challenge of preventing that is what would address that contention, and I don't know. I'm kind of presuming that there is a way of solving these problems at each scale, and I'm also presuming that the kind of system that is put in place is able to solve the problem. So again, I'm asking for a lot of concessions, but
well, yeah, this, as I said earlier, you're getting close to the realm of pointing out that if I'm handcuffed, I won't be able to use my hands.
But granting all of that it is possible, and this is an effective way of mitigating these threats, I just see that as preferable in terms of utilitarianism to a libertarian future where who knows what devastating technology might emerge at some point. Who knows what tyrant planet might come out and genocide worlds across the galaxy. There's just no way of mitigating those threats long term with a libertarian order. So the advantage goes to the possibility of addressing these threats rather than no possibility.
Well, by forcing me to make that many concessions, I mean, listen to what you just said. You said, well, I'm assuming that there would be an effective way for the state to handle this. Well, if there's an effective way for your galactic state system to handle it, well, by assumption, then it follows by definition that it will be able to handle it. and therefore the libertarian alternative will not. But that's not, you know what I
No,
mean?
no, no. It doesn't follow that the libertarian alternative
You're
won't.
rigging the game.
Yeah. I admit that there is a spectrum. Attempts at implementing the solution I'm talking about would vary from catastrophically bad attempts that lead to extinction potentially to like the one and only right way that this could work, and it just, you hit the bullseye, it works. And I'm presuming that that's possible. Now, it doesn't entail that if that is possible, that libertarianism can't address these problems. I'm just not seeing within the logic of the libertarian position how these threats are meaningfully addressed. I'd rather go with a chance of mitigating threats than no chance.
Oh, okay. So you're alleging that there would be no way at all to fight the interplanetary cult leader, or?
Well, there may well be, but I mean, even going back to the problem of runaway technologies and unintended consequences, how does the libertarian order prevent that? It seems like you just have to swallow. There will always be this threat that some new technology that you never heard of, that came out of some bunker somewhere, destroys human life, destroys the ecosystem.
Yes, you do, but you do that cognizant of the fact that an analogous threat also remains if you have a state system which is empowered to develop these technologies. So, the question then becomes, where is the threat greater? And if the state elite are insulated from consequence, I think you have a good case that the threat in the state cases is higher. I mean, let's use the nuclear weapons example. People, I've suggested this a number of times, and people sort of react with horror to this because it's so counter to the way most people think. But imagine a situation in which every country on Earth has a nuclear arsenal. Like every country on Earth can annihilate every other country. So, I mean, I think the chances of world peace would be quite high there. I mean, the cost of engaging in some kind of war would be catastrophically high, and you probably wouldn't have it. Now, on the other hand, suppose you have just one country or just a small number of countries that possess nuclear weapons. Well, now you have a nuclear cartel, and they can run roughshod over everyone else. And, I would just point out empirically that the only time that nuclear weapons have in fact been used on civilians was when the United States was the only country that possessed nuclear weapons. Mm-hmm. I don't think that's an accident. I think those things are related to one another. So, it's just a question of like power balance and technological balance. If the cult leader in your interplanetary empire had the ability to, send asteroids to destroy worlds, there's no reason to think immediately that the libertarian planet wouldn't have similar technologies and wouldn't be able to use them as a deterrent.
Well, as a deterrent, the issue there was the hypothetical technological limitations of interplanetary warfare. Like, maybe it's really easy to send the giant space rock. It's really hard to avoid it if it's hurled at you. So by the time you find out it's coming, it's too late, and you can't launch your counteroffensive. Well,
yes. But then the point is, if you can send the space rocket at your enemy, it will be hard for them to avoid it also. And so if you have the ability to strike your enemy with the space rock and they have the ability to strike you with it, both of you, realizing the costs to each of you, will, put down the space rock thing and not attack each other.
Okay. Right. But if sending the space rock doesn't leave time to respond with a counteroffensive space rock, then this threat of reprisal it doesn't matter. So really, it's a technical question. Is there a possibility for this threat of reprisal in a meaningful sense? There is for nuclear strikes, because we know that the missiles are coming. There's time to launch the other missiles. It might not work that way with the asteroids, but.
Well, yeah. I mean, my response to that is that you're just you're constricting the example, in a way that loads the dice against the against the opposing position.
Okay, well, we'll go away from these examples then and just kind of look at the basic principles that they're meant to illustrate, which is, is there a solution to this threat? Is there a best solution to this threat of unbridled technological development? Is there a best solution for guaranteeing, intergalactic peace long term? Is there a best way of organizing, technological development and politics? And I suspect there is, just based on the fact that there's one true reason underlying reality. There is one truth, and I don't know. It seems natural. This is kind of a separate point, actually, that I'm leading into here, but we probably shouldn't go too far into it. We should probably schedule a part 2 as well, sometime soon. So, the question is, is there a way for a ruling class to know which direction to develop technology better than just trying everything and seeing what works? My suspicion is that human appetite is more unlimited than the good for the human being. And in a libertarian world, the market will provide for every appetite rather than all human needs. And the technologies we pursue will be similarly unfettered. We will get the good and the bad. I mean, we could admit there are bad technologies in terms of utilitarian consequence and good technologies. Well, if it's possible to institute this most rational of all orders, this closest approximation to the truth in a guardian society, then you can try to put the technologies out there which conduce to human happiness and needs rather than this kind of unfettered desire. Yes, if you get that wrong, then it's a big downside, because now you don't get the needs provided, and you've eliminated the possibility of some redundant system doing the same, because you've gotten all of your eggs in one basket. But I think there's a trade-off. There are times when you want to distribute your eggs. There are times when you want them in one basket. And whether you want to put all of your eggs in one basket has to do with how sturdy that basket is, how much you can trust the person carrying that basket. And I guess I just have faith that there is one overriding reason that we're all participating in. And if a society structured itself strictly according to that reason, then it would be able to find effectively that best of all worlds. Because the libertarian order is not, to me, doesn't lead to the best of all worlds. You take the good with the bad. You get the salesman manipulating people to buy products. And then there's a whole other class of objections to libertarianism that come from this vein, where without literally aggressing against someone in terms of physical force, you can manipulate them through media. You can, if you, develop, I also use this example with Joel, but some kind of hypnosis beam. Is that an aggression? If music has hypnotic quality, isn't it possible using non-aggressive means to manipulate what the people want, so that there's elevated demand for your unnecessary products that aren't really helping anyone? You're going to get that. You're going to get scams. You're going to get people being sucked into schemes. Whereas in a paternalistic, more guardian-oriented society, there is the possibility that you get it right, and that happiness is engendered more so, overall. So.
Okay. Well, I guess my response to that is that I can't. All right, I'll put it this way. I go back to the same point that I've been stressing, that people most likely can't be trusted to behave themselves, especially over the long term, if there are not consequences to them. Take the hypnosis array example that you mentioned. Yeah, sure. A nefarious salesman might get one of these things and he'll start using it to start scamming people. But what if a state gets it? Oh God, that's terrifying. So better to have a salesman conduct his like low-level scams than a government turning tens or hundreds of millions or even more people into zombies. So it's a question of scale. I've said earlier that some amount of risk, some amount of downside is just a part of life, and you have to swallow it. And the question becomes mitigation. Now, as far as can we trust a ruling class to behave, my answer is not unless there are consequences for misbehavior. And the state form is such that it's designed to prevent those consequences. You can fiddle around with it and do all sorts of technical fixes of the sort that you're suggesting. But, granting that these things are technologically feasible, if we achieve a level of elite circulation that's like smooth enough to where it approaches what you'd get under a purely libertarian system anyway, then functionally it seems like that society would just devolve into the libertarian system, at least in terms of its utilitarian consequences, right? So, the question then becomes like, would the elite agree to subject themselves voluntarily to the pressure of circulation? And I don't see why they would. What's in it for them,
Right. That goes back to the way that the whole thing would have to be instituted. And I guess the advantage of this kind of political philosophy is also pragmatic in that you can just start moving towards it now. You can try to, live in the image of the Guardian and participate of that life and build communities that are approximating towards this most rational form of organization, and build a lot of them and solve a lot of problems before you ever have to coercively influence anyone, right? This can be voluntary up until the point where you have overwhelming global supremacy of firepower because you're better scientists or whatever.
No, I agree with you that there is a universal reason that if we properly discipline ourselves, we can tend toward. But it also has to be remembered that we live in the real world and we inhabit vessels of flesh, and that we have egoistic desires and desires for power. Sadism, frankly, motivates quite a few people. And we have to understand this and realize that humans' ability to handle power in the real world is limited, and so there have to be consequences imposed for the misuse of it. My basic objection to the state form is that it allows a centralization of power without consequences.
Mm-hmm. But what if, spreading these communities before they take over the world, communities in the image of the Guardians, you somehow solve this basic problem of sin and corruption and greed? If that was the case, you had this rising Jedi Order, Guardian Order, whatever you want to call it. If they demonstrate before they take coercive power that they can handle it and that their system of cultivation actually is effective, then I don't see the harm in it. Most of your objections come from, well, how could the global system fail? But if it demonstrates before it becomes that global system that it's actually very successful and more successful than other systems, then I don't know. I don't see the harm in it.
Well, my system is not based on the assumption that we can eliminate sin.
Yeah, but I mean, we don't know if we can. Maybe we can by living in the right way and finding the right spiritual technology, or maybe technology itself. This is a point that Joe Rogan has mentioned often. Maybe technology itself will modify our ability to communicate to such an extent that the distance between individuals lessens, and your thoughts kind of blend into my thoughts more so, and we acquire somehow more of a hive mind. Then the idea of individual actors might break down because the psychological structure of individuated consciousness that we're used to itself breaks down. So if that kind of game-changing shift took place, whether through a purely religious philosophy or through some kind of technology that facilitated that, then what? What do you say to the hive mind guardian elite?
Well, I mean, I would just go back to saying that you should take man as you find him. If Christ returns and inaugurates the millennium, okay, then fine, all bets are off. But until then, we have to live in the world of the realities of power, the reality of sin and its corruption, and we have to make arrangements for that. As far as like technology generating a hive mind, I mean, you can sort of see some of that in that there is a kind of nebulous global culture emerging already. I don't know how far it's reasonable to push that line of thinking, though. I mean, I can certainly grant that there could be this kind of commonality, but to have it go literally to the point where everyone's thoughts are so convergent that distinctions all disappear between them, I don't know. I mean,
yeah, right. Maybe not all distinctions, but maybe like the calculus of the greater good ends up taking greater priority than the individual good past a certain point, and people tend to think more in terms of those, what is for the greater good kind of calculations.
Yeah.
Well.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I mean, I think my response to that is pretty predictable. That you can arrange something like that, but only with proper social feedback mechanisms in place to punish those who don't adhere to those values, which is the crux of my objection to the state. Well, one side of it. There are other things I didn't go into. I chose this particular route because anyway.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think there are more points that I had written down that I wanted to address, but I don't really have the endurance to go much longer than 2.5 hours. So I think we should probably go ahead and wrap up here. Yeah. So I took us all on this kind of sci-fi journey in examining these questions, and I don't apologize for that because sci-fi is cool and I like it, and I don't care if people think it's not. It's helpful in thinking about philosophical problems, especially. Now, the thing about the kind of distributivism ideal that I'm talking about is we can build it now with libertarian principles. We never have to violate the non-aggression principle. We can look for that better order, look for that guardian society, and maybe it turns out that ultimately, there are non-violent ways of guaranteeing the security of everyone, guaranteeing everyone's right to territory, and we can maintain, like, best of all possible worlds, no coercion necessary, great, right? But the step one is always going to be the same. It's trying to live in accordance with reason, trying to live in community that is guided by reason, and, I don't kind of preemptively rule out that at a certain point in time, coercion might lead to better moral outcomes than the lack of coercion. But anyway, for the time being, I can be effectively a libertarian and build my global guardian order gradually. Not a lot of progress so far, but I'm sure any day now it'll tick up. So yeah, like I said at the beginning, I don't think we disagree that much. And the kind of global system I'm talking about would be minarchist, where the people outside of the system are left alone to the greatest extent possible. Except that you don't get to work on your nuke in your garage. You're not allowed to do that. Certain other things that pose a threat to everybody else, you're not going to be allowed to do. But as far as all the ordinary behaviors that human beings exhibit, that they've cared about evolutionary, we can maintain all of those, and I can accept like some principle of liberty as providentially guided. We have a lot more agreement than disagreement. But yeah, maybe looking ahead to like our next conversation, what do you think could be clarified? We've been all over the place here. What could be clarified? If you had to like pithily sum up what the nature of our disagreement is, Is it in epistemology? Is it in metaphysics fundamentally? Where is that disagreement, and how could we best tackle this next time to get a little bit more clarity?
Well, this was enjoyable just because it allowed me to clearly distill some of the basic bedrock differences between us, and we came down to a few things like that question of where to draw the line between which creatures are allowed to have rights and which not, whether the ability to grasp universals and have reason is fundamental or not. So there's that kind of metaphysical difference. There's that. And then there's also just, I guess, a fundamental difference in the view of human nature. Like I said, my political philosophy is not based on the idea that we can eliminate sin. I just kind of take that as it is and go from there. But yeah, I mean, I think as far as the differences go, that pretty much sums it up in the pithiest way possible. As far as what I'd like to do next time, well, most of this discussion was really just you making objections and me sort of answering them. And, considering the degree to which I've been willing to go along with your hypotheticals, I think it went pretty well. Like, I've said on a few occasions that some of them were just, I think, unfairly restrictive, but I went along with them for the most part, and I think if I can respond to objections even under the sort of stressful conditions of the examples that you've put together to try and make it as difficult as possible for me, then how well can I do under better conditions? So the next time around, I'd like you to talk in more detail about your own system, about distributivism, because this is more about you objecting to my view of things. So I guess the next time we do this, let's switch roles.
Sure. Yeah, sounds good. I only make the scenarios difficult because I know you can handle it, Ivan, and you love testing yourself. So, all right. Well, yeah, this was enjoyable. Let's see. I could look at a couple questions in the chat if you have time before we wrap up. Okay. So someone, what's that?
Are they goofing off as usual?
Yeah, usually. It looks mostly that, but Saramer asks, is a question for me, which language would they speak? The Guardians, the managerial elite, serious question. Whatever language the people involved use, I would suppose it would be English. If that's imperialist, oh well. Or multiple languages. It's not like you have to enforce one singular language across the board. But I do think that language is a kind of natural monopoly, just like social networking sites. There are certain advantages to just settling with whatever is convenient. Okay, Man asks, how do we defend ourselves against monopoly capital?
Well, in actual fact, historically, the word monopoly was associated with state-granted privileges to corporations. And over time, this usage has faded and instead has just come to mean a really large firm that controls, an entire market. And there are two ways that a firm could come to control an entire market. It could do so because the state is explicitly enforcing barriers to entry on its behalf and protecting it. And the other way is that the firm is just so good at fulfilling consumer desires that no one is able to compete with it. Now, in the former case, I would certainly oppose that because that imposes a loss on consumers and gives them a worse situation that they might otherwise enjoy. But even if you have a firm that is able through, despite being subjected to the rigors of market competition to still somehow achieve monopolistic status, this can only be done not only by fulfilling the desires of consumers to the greatest possible extent, but by continuously doing so, and by responding at each and every point to the changes and vicissitudes of those desires. And the actual presence of competition doesn't even need to be there to threaten that firm into behaving. The mere threat of competition is enough. The example I mentioned earlier of Rockefeller buying out his competitors and then the competitors using the money he gave them to just start up new oil companies. The mere threat that those competitors could start up an oil company is going to have some effect on Rockefeller's behavior. So there's always going to be that check. I think in actual fact, it would be very difficult to achieve a monopoly on the free market. But if it is achieved, this can only be done if you actually benefit consumers. There's also the further problem that if you actually have a truly monopolistic firm on the free market, it will run into the calculation problem. That is, it will control resources to such a vast extent that prices can no longer form with, as a result of the jostling of supply and demand. And so if it's not able to form prices for the various production factors that it uses, it's not going to know how to allocate them. And that's going to swiftly push the firm down a peg.
Very nice. Okay. So there were, I think you already answered this objection, but people mentioned, how would the non-coercive libertarian society deal with being blitzkrieged by a Russian invasion, for example?
Well, one thing they might do is they might, distribute rifles to the civilian population, and this is actually happening, by the way, in Ukraine. But a sort of general answer is that decentralized armed forces are much more flexible, and they're able to respond to changing conditions much more easily. But of course, you would have, let's say you had a full anarcho-capitalist society. People would have contracts with insurance companies that then in turn would, buy services from protection firms, and they would put in place, various measures in the event of a war. And if there was a serious threat of a Russian blitzkrieg, you would get a swift response because there'd be an economic incentive to generate that response. You wouldn't have this slow kind of lumbering movement of state machinery. That's a very general answer. And to give a detailed answer, you'd have to go into specifics, and that would take a long time, but that's the general outline of it.
Yeah, very nice. Okay. I will say, in favor of libertarianism as a philosophy, I was always shocked when I was first getting into it by how well libertarians could respond to these sorts of objections, security concerns, public infrastructure. They always have an argument.
Well, there is a general pattern of reasoning. I always emphasize throughout this discussion the ability to, respond to social feedback, and the ability of decentralized networks to do that versus the fact that a state generally lacks that ability by design. So once you understand that, you could apply that principle to different areas and then construct those arguments. So it looks like you're just being endlessly fertile in your creativity, but you're actually following a common line of reasoning in every case. The differences are just in the details.
Yeah, I did. I couldn't identify it as well as you, but I did sense there's this one pattern underlying these explanations. All right. Well, I think that's it for all the serious questions. I just want to kind of double back one last time for my own sake and say we don't know whether it's possible to eliminate sin. We don't know if the truly virtuous society can be built, which is why we kind of just have to aim at it, build it, see if it works. And if it does, if everything works out, then maybe a scenario like what I described could come out of that. But I wouldn't decide at the outset that humans are just inalienably sinful creatures. If Jesus does come back and we all are brought into one fellowship of man, one body, things could be different. And those sorts of possibilities, while maybe romantic and a little unrealistic, they should never be completely dismissed or thrown out. You have to have some hope for utopia, I think. And libertarians are utopian enough, so I do appreciate that. But all right, everybody. Thoughts and prayers to Ukraine. A lot of aggression going on, unfortunately. Did you want to say anything about that, just real quick before we wrap up?
Just a mess. It's absolutely horrible. On a personal level, as far as I know, my family is safe. So no one that I know personally. Oh yeah, for those who don't know, I am Ukrainian actually. But yeah, my own family members over there are all safe, at least at the moment. And the Ukrainian army has acquitted itself extremely well. They're holding back a much larger force. And before I started this discussion, the Russians were still outside of Kiev. I think I don't know. I mean, but it seems to me that Putin has sort of drunk his own Kool-Aid and believed that he could storm into the country, and he really believed this whole Ukrainians and Russians are brothers thing that he's pushing. So it really does look like he thought there would be enough domestic support for what he's doing that the country would just capitulate, and that's not happening.
Yeah, very interesting. I don't know enough about the cultural history to evaluate those sorts of things. I know there are a lot of ethnic Russians in Ukraine, so how this ends up at the end of the day, I mean, who knows? But do you have any prediction?
I don't know. I mean, they've already surprised me. I knew that their will to fight would be very high, but they've outperformed even my expectations. And considering how outnumbered and outgunned they are, that's extraordinary. I've heard because as I'm following this, I've sort of been switching back and forth between American and Ukrainian news sources. And there's an advisor to the Ukrainian president that early this morning announced that there's about 3,500 Russian casualties so far. If after 3 days, which is quite amazing. Yeah, I mean I don't know whether that's actually true or whether he's saying it to boost morale. But if it is true, it wouldn't surprise me because that tends to be a Russian tactic when they're at war. They have an enormous army and they just throw bodies at the problem. So, yeah, I mean, it's precarious, but the Ukrainians are fighting hard. They're outnumbered, they're outgunned, and yet no major cities have been taken. That's extraordinary.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's for reasons like that, the libertarians have a point. This sort of warfare, people underestimate, like nationalists underestimate how real the consequences are for things like that. And, people on the right have been romantics about various dictators, so forth. The reality is always a little, harder to swallow. So, yeah, thoughts and prayers to Ukraine. Thank you guys for listening, and we'll hopefully pick this back up in a few weeks or something like that, so you can look forward to another stream. But until then,